Let's go through Emily Dickinson, and she's just like Whitman in that she's profoundly influential on American poetry, but unlike Whitman in almost every other aspect. And so she's a dramatically different type of poet, but she's occupied a place of equal importance as Whitman. But she didn't occupy that place until around 40 years after she died, which is weird. Okay. Um, about her. Now, she's born, I'm going to estimate around 1830 or so, in Amherst, Massachusetts, and she lives pretty much under her own. Her parents and her family are pretty much her world. It's school and things like that. We don't know much about her, and that is kind of sketchy. She was never married in her life that we know of. Um, did she have relationships? Maybe. She seems to have maybe had something going on the side with her maybe her brother's wife. We don't know. And there seems to have been a relationship with with a gentleman, but again, we don't know. It's very ambiguous, and that's something that plays out in Dickinson's poetry. Her She will take something that is difficult and simplify it, but it will make it very clear that she's simplified something that's difficult. And so she'll make simplicity out of difficulty, and that will make simplicity difficult to understand, if that makes any sense. Okay. And so Dickinson can be, in one regard, very easy to read. But always keep in mind there's going to be aspects of her poems that just aren't making sense. You will have multiple readings in any single poem at the same time. This is a characteristic of her poetry. Make darn sure you don't settle on a simple interpretation, because what she does is constantly frustrate that and make it more complicated, because that's the way life is. In order to publish her poetry, they edited it out, they cleaned it up, and took the edges off of it, the punctuation and all that, and the dash. It was very awkward. And let's clean it up, and let's not those allusions to that. I'll show you what some of the allusions are. They were all cleaned out of it, and it was made into a book of poems that reads very much like a Hallmark card. Okay. And that came out soon after her death, I believe. And again, it was ignored. I believe I mentioned before, it was around the 1830s or 40s or something like that. A professor found her work and went through it and was dumbfounded that this had not been discovered before. And he published it, and I believe he published it in the 50s. She took on a life of her own. Her fame grew and grew and grew. Into the 60s, when she really started to, occupy a position of prominence along with Whitman, because this was a very distinct American voice in the poetry. And be aware again, you will get a simple surface on it, and you will want to understand the poem in simple terms, but you will get frustrated with Dickinson again and again, because why in all the ambiguity and complexity. Okay, let me shrink myself up and we'll give you some examples of this. And I won't do all of the poems that I have here. And again, I think there's well over 1,000 poems of hers. I just picked a selection of it. Some of the poems are pretty bad. They really are. And that's not just me, they're just bad. The ones I've given you here are some of the finest, and they're not, well, let's jump in. Hope is a thing with feathers. And again, this title is, all the titles of all of her poems are really just the first lines of the poems. Okay. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And I want you to take note of the fact that it is kind of sing-songy and kind of pretty, but it's also kind of off. Something's wrong here. Just kind of. It's invited you into a kind of Hallmark card kind of poem, and then it never stops at all. Hope just doesn't stop. It's kind of like that 4-year-old who keeps playing this, why doesn't he just cut it out? Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings a tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that keeps so many warm. And notice how pretty that is. And if Dickinson ever gets pretty, you should, no, that's not going to happen. I've heard it in the chilliest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. And notice that it gets a little weird, and it's a bird at first, and then it's going through all these difficult times, and it stays there with you, and hope. We got to hold on to hope, and we got to get this Hallmark card out. But notice it never, whenever they're at the edges and extremity, it never asked a crumb of me. So in other words, it's ignoring me. And that's odd. And that's the nature of hope. And as little as we know of Emily's Dickinson's life, she did have struggles over the nature of death, and I wouldn't call it. I'm uncomfortable calling it depression, but she struggled apparently with notions of death and experiencing death of people close to her. And this is hope, like she's talking about, and it starts to like almost as if it's going to take wings, but then it never asked a crumb of me. That's weird. In other words, it never asks anything of her. It's not paying attention to her. It's indifferent to her. It has nothing to do with her. So that's very odd. So let's jump up to another one. And again, it's the simplicity on the surface is always disrupted by the ambiguity under it. In all of her good poems, that happens. In many of her poems, they stay superficial. The ones we have here, it gets a little bit more. And you have a number of these very short poems. Faith is a fine invention for gentlemen who see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. That's odd. And it's faith in quotation marks, which you saw up here with hope. What do the quotation marks mean? Does it mean she doesn't really mean it? I don't know. Faith is a fine invention. Usually faith is not described as an invention. And it seems it's only for gentlemen, okay? But then this odd thing about microscopes in an emergency. Microscopes aren't exactly emergency gear that you have around in case of a storm. It's to understand things in detail. And microscopes were a fairly recent invention. People were just getting used to them. That gets weird. If it were, a fire extinguisher, well, which she wouldn't have, but a bucket of water to put out a fire, then it could probably be understood. But it's a microscope. That's odd. And it's troubling again. Faith is a fine invention. It's neither an embracing of faith, which we don't know much about her perspective on things. We have certain letters from her proclaiming that, she was enthusiastic about a revival and a few other things in her town. But then she doesn't go to Mass or go to services that often. Yeah. So watching me run out of words is me teaching Dickinson. And then there's this one. This is weird, and this gets into some of her sexuality, at least in her poems. And I started early, took my dog. That sounds cool. We're going to have a walk, right? Hold on. And visited the sea. The mermaids in the basement came out to look at me. Now, this is odd, and it's going to get a little more troubling. But I started out early, took my dog. Okay. And visited the sea. Now, there are some readings of this poem, and I agree with these elements in here, that this is something sexual going on here. But she took her dog. That's weird. And visited the sea. And the sea and ocean is frequently used as a, let me blow myself up here, as a sexual reference because of the repetitive nature of it. And I won't go into that too much, in the forcefulness of it. And that seems to be there, but I took my dog. And the mermaids in the basement, huh, I, I'm not sure what to make out of that. Now, mermaids obviously aren't going to have any clothes on, but the basement, what? That's kind of weird. And the mermaids in the basement came out to look at me. In other words, some people are following her, but okay, I don't know too much of what to make of that. But there are mermaids in the basement. That's really odd. Mermaids in the basement? Mermaids are supposed to be out at sea and doing their own darn thing and be free from things. But these mermaids are all locked up and hanging out there and looking out the windows. That's odd. And now, one of the readings that can be done with this is that the women of Amherst are kind of repressed and held under, in basements and stuff like that when they're really mermaids. That could be, but again, following it through, I can't say that's not a reasonable interpretation, but it doesn't always hold up. Okay. And frigates in the upper floor extended hempen hands, presuming me to be a mouse, around upon the sands. But no man moved me. No man moved me, till the tide went past my simple shoe. In other words, I was touched by the water. And again, the ocean, the sea, is a fairly common reference to sexuality. But no man moved me until the tide went past my simple shoe. In other words, until I was basically touched. And I want to emphasize this reading that this is the beginning of a sexual encounter is perfectly reasonable, but it gets a little bit troubling. And past my apron in my belt and past my bodice too. In other words, it's moving up her body. The tide is moving up her body. And I don't need to explain that too much. It does seem to have a sexual innuendo in it, but it's, boy, it gets a little bit difficult here. And made as he would eat me up. Okay. And so suddenly it becomes, it's a capital He, which is a religious reference, sorta, and he would eat me up. It becomes more, this is threatening. This is getting out of control, and this has become threatening. As holy as a dew upon a dandelion sleeve. And then I started too. This is very gentle. When it was becoming overwhelming and then almost violent, and then it becomes extremely gentle. That's Dickinson. She is constantly frustrating any simple reading you're going to make of her. And a very important thing is to understand that these and different interpretations exist simultaneously in her. The different interpretations exist simultaneously. She's going in multiple directions at the same time. It's not like she's going in one direction, then takes a turn. Instead, she's going in all these directions simultaneously. And so again, she takes on the simplicity on the surface, but not for long. It doesn't stay that way. And he followed close behind. And now it's getting creepy. I felt his silver heel upon my ankle. Then my shoes would overflow with pearl. That's odd. Until we met the solid town, no one he seemed to know. And bowing with a mighty look at me, the sea withdrew. That, oh boy, that's weird. Okay. And so the sea withdrew as if it was going to come into town with her, and then it pulled back and left. And so this seems to be an encounter that Emily Dickinson may have had with somebody who it didn't last long. It seems. And so the ambiguity is always there, and it seems to be very suggestive. And she suggests things and then drops them after developing them for a while. And boy, it gets difficult. Okay, but that's Dickinson. That's how she works. She goes after the complexity, where Whitman would kind of overwhelm you with democracy and the sense of everybody's invited and let's have a block party. Dickinson is, don't bother me now. Let me close my door. Okay, Wild Nights, Wild Nights. This one is well known. I'll wrap it up with this, I guess. Um, but I just want you to see something. This is frequently misinterpreted because it's interpreted as a simplicity. Wild Nights, that's pretty clear. This is going to get a little bit funky. Were I with thee, were I, that's what they call the subjunctive. It would be nice, that could be, I'm thinking of you, I guess. Wild nights should be our luxury. And so this seems to be something sexual, right? And she's just